They were sent to Earth to learn what weakness felt like. The storm rolled in just after midnight, swallowing the small Alaskan town of Port Lawson in a wall of static and blue-white lightning that cracked across the sky without thunder, as if the sound itself had frozen at 20 below. Ethan Carter was halfway up a wind turbine tower when the grid failed. 1 second the red indicator lights blinked steady along the ridge, the next they died in a ripple, house by house, mile by mile, until the coastline went black. His harness tugged against his shoulders as he looked north, breath fogging inside his thermal mask. The air smelled wrong, sharp and metallic, like overheated wiring. Then he saw it. A streak of silver tearing through the clouds, too controlled to be a meteor, too silent to be a plane. It descended beyond the tree line in a slow arc and vanished behind the frozen hills with a pulse that rattled the steel beneath his boots. By the time Ethan climbed down, the snow had started again, fine and slanting sideways in the wind. He should have called it in. That was protocol. Instead, he grabbed his truck keys and drove toward the impact site with the heater blasting and the radio spitting nothing but static. The forest swallowed the headlights after the pavement ended. Pine branches sagged under fresh powder, and the tires crunched over ice as he followed the faint glow ahead, a soft blue shimmer bleeding through the trees like moonlight trapped under glass. He found the crater at the edge of a clearing he used for summer fishing. It wasn't a crater, not really. The snow had melted in a perfect circle about 30 feet wide, steam curling from the exposed earth. At the center sat something smooth and oval, about the size of a small camper, its surface pulsing faintly, as if it were breathing. Ethan stepped closer, boots sinking into slush, heart thudding in a steady, measured rhythm he recognized from years of fixing things that shouldn't be broken. A seam appeared along the side of the object with a quiet hiss. The shell unfolded in segments, petals opening to the cold. Inside were 2 figures, curled toward each other. They looked human at first glance, 2 young women, maybe early 20s, but their skin caught the light in a way that wasn't human at all. One shimmered deep sapphire, the other a softer blue with a silver undertone that reflected the snow like frost. Thin metallic bands circled their wrists and throats, glowing faintly before flickering out. The darker one opened her eyes first. Gold, not brown or hazel or green. Gold, sharp and assessing. She pushed herself up with controlled precision, gaze locking onto Ethan as if measuring him against a standard he couldn't see. The lighter one stirred more slowly, her movements careful, almost fragile, silver lashes catching snowflakes as they drifted down. Ethan raised his hands instinctively, palms open. "Hey," he said, voice steady despite the way his pulse kicked harder. "You're not going to make it out here without help." The darker one's eyes narrowed. She said something in a language that sounded like wind through glass, then glanced at the dead forest around them, at the empty sky, at him again. The lighter one looked at Ethan differently, not with suspicion, but with something quieter. Not fear. Not exactly. Curiosity. Behind them, the pod dimmed, its glow fading until only the storm remained, whispering across the clearing. And in that frozen circle of melted snow, under a sky that had just swallowed the power of an entire town, Ethan Carter realized whatever had fallen from above hadn't come by accident. The darker one moved first, stepping out of the open shell with a grace that did not belong in a snow-covered clearing at 20 below. Steam curled around her bare feet, but she did not flinch. The lighter one followed more carefully, her balance uncertain on the slush as if gravity itself felt heavier here. Ethan took off his gloves despite the cold and offered one hand, slow and deliberate. The darker one's gaze dropped to it, then back to his face, calculating. "You are the dominant male of this territory?" she asked, her voice clear now, the words shaped with faint distortion as though filtered through something invisible. Ethan blinked once. "I fix wind turbines and snowplows," he said. "That is about as dominant as it gets around here." The lighter one's lips twitched, almost a smile. The darker one did not smile. "We were assigned to this world," she said. Correction through immersion. The metallic bands at their throats flickered one last time and dissolved into dust that drifted into the melted snow. Ethan watched the particles fade. "Assigned by who?" he asked. The darker one lifted her chin slightly. "By authority beyond your planetary systems." There was no arrogance in her tone, only fact. The wind picked up, cutting through Ethan's jacket. He looked at their bare shoulders, at the way frost began forming along the lighter one's hair. Authority or not, you are going to freeze out here, he said. My truck is half a mile back. Heat works. So does coffee. The lighter one glanced toward the dark tree line, then at her sister. Lyra, she said softly. The darker one, Lyra, hesitated. Ethan did not miss it. For all her composure, something in her eyes flickered when the wind howled louder. Not fear. Uncertainty. He turned and started walking toward the trees without waiting for an answer. After a few steps he heard them behind him, light footsteps on crusted snow. The truck engine coughed twice before turning over. Warm air blasted from the vents, fogging the windshield. The sisters sat rigid in the passenger seats, studying the dashboard lights, the texture of fabric, the faint country music bleeding from the silent radio signal. Mira ran her fingers an inch above the heater vent, watching the rising heat like it was a new element discovered. Lyra watched Ethan's hands on the steering wheel instead. You do not question why we are here, Lyra said after a mile of silence. Ethan kept his eyes on the narrow road. Everybody ends up somewhere they did not plan, he said. First thing you do is get them warm. Questions can wait until morning. Myra's gaze shifted to him again, softer this time. Outside, the entire town lay dark, power still out from the storm. Houses stood quiet under snow, porch lights dead. Lyra leaned slightly toward the window, studying the sleeping streets. Your species lives without constant surveillance, she murmured. No central command visible. Ethan shrugged. We have plenty of command. It just looks like paperwork. Mira let out a quiet breath that almost sounded like laughter. When the truck turned into Ethan's driveway, the porch light flickered weakly on backup power. The small wooden house stood steady against the storm, smoke rising faintly from the chimney. Lyra's eyes narrowed at the sight of something so ordinary. This is your dwelling, she said. Yes, ma'am. Ethan replied, cutting the engine. It is not a palace, but it is dry. And as he stepped out into the wind and moved to open their door, Lyra realized that whatever punishment they had expected, it did not begin with chains. It began with a man who simply refused to leave them in the cold. The door closed behind them with a solid wooden thud that sounded louder than it should have in a house that small. Warm air wrapped around Lyra and Mira instantly, carrying the scent of pine smoke and something faintly sweet from the kitchen. Ethan kicked snow from his boots and flipped a lantern onto the table when the ceiling lights flickered uncertainly on backup power. Grid is still down, he said, setting his gloves aside. Might be that way until morning. Mira stood just inside the entryway, turning slowly as her eyes tracked every detail. The framed photographs on the wall, a fishing rod propped in the corner, a stack of unpaid bills held down by a wrench. She reached toward the nearest picture but stopped an inch short, studying the glass like it might respond. Lyra stepped farther in, posture still straight, alert without appearing tense. This structure is inefficient, she observed quietly. Heat loss through windows exceeds optimal ratios. Ethan shrugged out of his jacket and handed them 2 thick flannel blankets from a hook by the door. Yeah, he said, but it was cheap. Mira accepted the fabric carefully, rubbing it between her fingers as if testing a new material. Organic weave, she murmured. Primitive, but comfortable. Lyra did not take hers at first. She studied Ethan instead. You do not attempt to extract information, she said. You do not alert your authorities. You do not restrain us. Ethan walked to the wood stove and adjusted the vent with steady hands. You landed in my fishing clearing, he replied. That makes you guests until you prove otherwise. The fire popped softly, sending orange light across the room. Lyra's sapphire skin caught the glow and deepened in color, shadows moving along her features like water. For a fraction of a second her expression shifted, something loosening at the edges. Mira stepped closer to the stove, extending her palms toward the warmth. She closed her eyes, inhaling slowly. Thermal exposure without discomfort, she said softly. It is pleasant. Ethan poured water from a kettle into 3 mugs and dropped in tea bags, the steam rising between them. Pleasant. Is good, he said. He handed one to Mira first. She cradled it carefully, watching the liquid swirl. Lyra finally took the blanket and draped it over her shoulders, though her chin remained lifted. Our assignment states that humans are unstable, Lyra said. Emotionally reactive, driven by impulse. Ethan leaned back against the counter, mug in hand. That is not wrong, he admitted. But we also fix each other's trucks in the snow. So it balances out. Myra's eyes opened again, silver reflecting firelight. We were evaluated for insufficient severity, she said quietly. We hesitated during enforcement simulations. Authority deemed us compromised. Ethan met her gaze without pity. Hesitated to do what? Mira hesitated again now, glancing at her sister. Lyra answered instead. To prioritize order over individual welfare. The words sounded memorized, as if repeated many times before. Ethan nodded once. Around here, he said, we call that having a conscience. Silence settled over the room, not heavy but thoughtful. Outside, the wind pressed against the siding, snow tapping the windows like distant fingers. Inside, the stove crackled steadily. Mira took a cautious sip of tea and blinked at the warmth spreading through her. Lyra watched her reaction closely, then looked back at Ethan. For the first time since stepping from the pod, her voice lowered a fraction. If this is punishment, she said, glancing around the modest room, it is poorly designed. Ethan smiled faintly. Give it time, he replied. But as he set another log into the fire, and the sisters stood there wrapped in borrowed warmth, neither of them felt corrected. They felt considered. Morning arrived without sunlight. The sky remained a flat sheet of gray, pressing low over Port Lawson as if the night had never fully ended. Ethan woke to the steady ticking of the wood stove and the faint hum of wind against the siding. For a moment he forgot the clearing, the pod, the blue glow. Then he heard quiet movement in the kitchen. He stepped out of his bedroom in flannel and socks and stopped in the doorway. Mira stood at the counter, holding a slice of bread in both hands as though it were a delicate instrument. She was studying the toaster with intense focus, silver hair falling forward as she tilted her head. Lyra stood by the window, watching the snow drift past the glass, her reflection faint against the storm. The power had not returned. Only the backup lantern cast a soft yellow circle over the table. It converts electricity into thermal radiation, Mira said without turning, her voice thoughtful. But your grid is inactive. Ethan nodded. You are correct. That makes it a very decorative box right now. Mira glanced at him, then back at the bread. Then you heat nourishment through combustion. That is the old-fashioned way. Ethan replied, moving toward the stove. He laid a cast-iron skillet over the flame and dropped the bread onto it. The faint scent of toasting filled the room. Mira inhaled slowly, eyes widening just a little. Lyra shifted from the window, watching the process as if committing it to memory. You adapt quickly to environmental failure, Lyra observed. We have practice, Ethan said. Winter does not care about planning committees. Outside, a plow truck crawled past at the end of the road, its engine rumbling low, clearing the first narrow path through the snow. Mira stepped closer to the stove, feeling the warmth rise again. Your settlement functions without centralized oversight during crisis, she said. Individual units act independently. Ethan flipped the bread carefully. That is called neighbors, he said. Lyra's gaze sharpened slightly. Authority in our world is constant, she said. Observation is continuous. Deviation is corrected immediately. Ethan looked up at her, studying the stillness in her posture. And how is that working out for you? He asked gently. Lyra did not answer right away. Instead, she walked to the table and traced one finger along the grain of the wood. The motion was slow, almost absent-minded. Mira finally took the toasted slice when Ethan handed it to her. She hesitated, then took a cautious bite. Her eyes closed again, but this time not from cold. Texture variation, she whispered. Heat and softness combined. A faint sound escaped her, not laughter exactly, but something close. Lyra watched her sister carefully, then took her own piece when Ethan offered it. She held it for a second longer than necessary before tasting it. The room fell quiet except for the stove and the distant scrape of snowplows outside. Ethan poured fresh tea and sat across from them at the small wooden table. So, he said calmly, what exactly were you supposed to learn here? Mira opened her eyes and looked at him directly. We were told that humans are governed by emotion, she said. That attachment creates instability. Lyra's voice followed, steady but softer than the night before. We were sent to confirm it. Ethan leaned back in his chair, steam rising between them. And what have you confirmed so far? Lyra glanced at the modest kitchen, the chipped mug in her hand, the faint warmth spreading through the small room. Her golden eyes met his, and for the first time there was no calculation in them. "We have confirmed," she said slowly, "that instability feels different from what we were taught." Outside, the snow continued to fall, quiet and unbothered, while inside the little house on the edge of town, something unseen had begun to shift. By late afternoon the town began to hum again, not loudly, but enough to signal that life had resumed its quiet rhythm. A distant generator kicked on somewhere down the road. The snowplow made another pass, slower now, carving clean lines through the white. Inside the house, Mira sat cross-legged on the living room rug, studying a small battery-powered radio Ethan had placed in front of her. Its casing was scratched, the volume knob slightly loose. She turned it gently, listening to static bloom and fade like distant ocean waves. "This device gathers signals from unseen sources," she said thoughtfully. "Voices that are not physically present." Ethan nodded from the hallway where he was pulling on his boots. "Local station is probably back online," he said. "Weather updates. School closures. Complaints about snow." Lyra stood near the bookshelf, her fingers hovering over the spines without touching. She had spent the last hour reading the titles out loud, testing the weight of each word. History of American Railways. Basic engine repair. The art of fly fishing. Her expression shifted subtly at that last one. "You record your knowledge in bound cellulose," she said. "You preserve experience in narrative form." Ethan walked back into the room and grabbed his coat. "Stories are cheaper than surveillance systems," he replied. Mira adjusted the radio again until a clear voice finally emerged, announcing the expected temperature drop to -10 degrees Fahrenheit overnight. She listened intently, head tilted, absorbing every syllable. "They warn each other," she murmured. "Freely." Lyra turned from the shelf. "In our system, warnings are restricted to authorized channels," she said. "Information is stratified." Ethan paused at the door and studied them both. "You two planning to stay inside all day?" he asked lightly. "Or you want to see the glamorous side of Port Lawson?" Mira looked up. "Define glamorous." "There is a diner with overcooked pancakes," he said, "and a hardware store that sells exactly 3 kinds of shovel." Lyra's golden eyes narrowed slightly, but not in suspicion. "In consideration. Exposure to broader social units may enhance our evaluation," she said. Ethan smiled faintly. "That is one way to say it." He opened the door and cold air rushed in, sharp but manageable compared to the night before. Mira stood and wrapped the borrowed flannel blanket tighter around her shoulders. Lyra stepped forward first this time, not hesitating at the threshold. Outside, sunlight finally broke through the cloud cover in thin bands, reflecting off miles of untouched snow. The world looked quiet, harmless, almost fragile. As they walked toward the truck, Mira slowed near the mailbox at the edge of the driveway. She brushed her fingers along the layer of frost on top, watching crystals melt under her touch. "This planet feels unguarded," she said softly. Lyra followed her gaze down the empty road, where 2 neighbors waved at Ethan in passing, unaware of the significance walking beside him. "It feels exposed," Lyra added. Ethan unlocked the truck and glanced back at them. "That is because it is," he said simply. "Nobody is watching us every second." Lyra held his gaze for a brief moment. Something unspoken passed between them, not authority and not defiance. Something closer to recognition. Mira climbed into the passenger seat, radio still in her hands, as if she did not want to lose the connection to distant voices. Lyra settled beside her, posture less rigid than before. As Ethan started the engine and the heater roared to life, neither sister spoke. But both watched the small town roll by through the windshield, and for the first time since their arrival, they were not observing it as subjects of study. They were observing it as participants. The diner bell chimed softly as Ethan pushed the door open, a wave of warm air and the scent of coffee rolling out to meet them. Conversations paused for half a second, not out of alarm but curiosity. Port Lawson did not receive many visitors in winter, especially not 2 women with luminous blue skin wrapped in borrowed flannel. Ethan gave a small nod to the waitress behind the counter. "Power back yet?" he asked. She shook her head and poured another mug. "Generator is keeping us running. Pancakes are still edible, more or less." Mira stepped inside slowly, her eyes lifting to the hanging lights strung across the ceiling. The bulbs hummed faintly, powered by a small portable unit in the corner. Localized energy source, she whispered, almost to herself. Lyra scanned the room differently. She observed the way people sat close together in booths, the way gloved hands wrapped around ceramic mugs, the way laughter rose without restraint from a table near the window. There were no guards. No visible hierarchy. Only layered coats and tired smiles. Ethan slid into a booth and gestured for them to join him. It is informal, he said. Nobody will salute you. Mira sat first, hands resting flat on the table as though feeling the grain of the wood. Lyra followed, her posture upright but less rigid than before. The waitress approached with 3 laminated menus. She did not stare. She simply smiled and asked, "Coffee?" Ethan nodded. Mira looked at Lyra, then back at the woman. "Yes," she said carefully. "Coffee." The mugs arrived steaming. Mira watched the surface ripple as the cup was set down. She leaned closer, studying the rising vapor. Bitter aroma, she noted. Complex. Ethan poured a small amount of cream into her cup without asking. "Try it like this," he said. She hesitated, then followed his example. Her first sip made her blink in surprise. Not discomfort. Adjustment. Lyra lifted her own mug and tasted it without modification. Her golden eyes narrowed slightly, then softened. "It is strong," she admitted. "Keeps us awake through long nights," Ethan replied. Across the room, an elderly man struggled to pull his chair closer to the table, his hands stiff from the cold. Without thinking, Mira stood and walked over, adjusting the chair gently so he could sit more comfortably. The man looked up at her in brief confusion, then gratitude. "Thank you, miss," he said. She returned to the booth slowly, something new flickering across her features. Lyra watched the exchange closely. "You assisted him without directive," Lyra observed. Mira looked down at her hands. "He required assistance," she said simply. Ethan did not comment. He only watched the two of them as plates of pancakes were set in front of them, syrup pooling along the edges. Lyra studied the golden surface before cutting a small piece and tasting it. Her expression shifted again, subtle but undeniable. Mira followed, and this time the sound she made was unmistakably a small laugh. Around them, conversations resumed. A woman near the counter complained about her driveway. A teenager discussed a basketball game postponed due to snow. No one monitored their tone. No one corrected their volume. The world continued imperfect and unfiltered. Lyra set her fork down and looked at Ethan. "If instability produces this," she said quietly, glancing at the room filled with warmth and unstructured kindness, "then perhaps it is not a flaw." Outside, sunlight reflected off the snow so brightly it almost hurt to look at. Inside, something colder than winter continued to thaw. The sky changed before the light did. Ethan noticed it as they stepped out of the diner. The air suddenly thinner, quieter, like the world had inhaled and forgotten to exhale. The sunlight reflecting off the snow dimmed slightly, not from clouds, but from something higher, something vast shifting behind the pale blue. Mira stopped mid-step, her gaze lifting instinctively. Lyra followed a second later, her posture tightening for the first time since morning. Above the town, barely visible against daylight, a faint geometric distortion shimmered like heat rising from asphalt. It was subtle enough that no one else seemed to notice. Cars continued along Main Street. A child laughed somewhere behind them. But Lyra's jaw set with recognition. "They are observing," she said quietly. Ethan looked up, squinting into the brightness. "Observing how?" he asked. Myra's voice was softer now, less analytical. "Our assigned evaluation window was limited," she said. Data collection would occur remotely. Lyra's golden eyes tracked the distortion as it pulsed once, then steadied. "They expected confirmation," she added. Not hesitation. Ethan felt a strange chill that had nothing to do with temperature. "Confirmation of what?" he asked. Lyra lowered her gaze to him, and for a fraction of a second something vulnerable flickered there. "That humans are emotionally unstable and strategically hazardous," she said. Recommendation for containment or removal would follow. The word removal hung in the cold air without explanation, heavy enough on its own. Mira looked back at the town, the diner, the hardware store across the street, the elderly man shuffling carefully along the sidewalk. They would not see this, she whispered. They would see volatility, conflict history, rapid technological escalation. Ethan crossed his arms, watching the sky the way a farmer watches approaching weather. "And what do you see?" he asked quietly. Lyra's attention shifted from the distortion above to the small town around her. A woman stepped out of the grocery store carrying 2 heavy bags, and without hesitation a teenage boy ran forward to help her. No command, no directive, just movement. Mira watched it too, her silver eyes bright. "I see choice," she said. The shimmer in the sky pulsed again, slightly stronger this time, then stabilized as if awaiting input. Lyra closed her eyes briefly. Ethan noticed the subtle change in her breathing, the way her shoulders rose and fell more deliberately. "They are requesting preliminary assessment," Lyra said. "Now." Ethan did not move closer, did not reach for them. He simply stood beside them in the snow-covered street, hands in his coat pockets. "Well," he said calmly, "do not let me interrupt your paperwork." Myra's lips curved faintly at that. Lyra opened her eyes and looked at him, really looked at him, not as subject or anomaly, but as a person standing in cold sunlight without fear. The distortion above shimmered again, almost impatient. Lyra's expression softened in a way it had not before. "Preliminary assessment," she repeated under her breath. Then her voice steadied. "Human emotional variance observed. Attachment behaviors frequent. Cooperative patterns strong. Adaptive resilience high." Mira glanced at her sister, then at Ethan. "Instability," Mira added quietly, "appears indistinguishable from compassion." The shimmer flickered once more, as though processing. Around them, the town continued without awareness. Boots crunching on packed snow, doors opening and closing, life unfolding in imperfect rhythm. Ethan did not look at the sky anymore. He looked at Lyra and Mira instead. And for the first time since they arrived, neither of them looked like exiles. They looked like someone deciding where they belonged. The shimmer above the town did not fade. It sharpened. What had looked like heat distortion began resolving into faint angular lines, a structure phasing just beyond visible spectrum. Mira felt at first a subtle vibration beneath her skin, like distant thunder too high to hear. Lyra stood perfectly still, her eyes fixed upward as information streamed silently across a channel Ethan could not see. The air around them seemed charged, thin threads of light weaving through daylight like invisible scaffolding. "They are escalating review," Lyra said quietly. "Final recommendation requested." Ethan exhaled slowly, watching his breath fog in the cold. "That sounds official," he replied. Across the street, the elderly man Mira had helped earlier waved at Ethan again before stepping carefully into the post office. No one else noticed the sky bending in quiet geometry above them. Myra's voice trembled slightly for the first time. "If we confirm hazard status, intervention protocols activate." Ethan glanced at her. "And if you do not?" Lyra answered. "Then responsibility transfers to us." The words carried weight. Not punishment. Choice. The distortion intensified briefly, forming a faint triangular outline that only the sisters could fully perceive. A silent pulse pressed against their senses, insistent but not violent, demanding conclusion. Mira closed her eyes. In her mind flashed images from less than 24 hours ago. The stove's warmth, the bitter taste of coffee softened by cream, the elderly man's grateful nod, the teenage boy lifting grocery bags without instruction. No command hierarchy, no enforcement grid, just decisions made in seconds. "They measure stability by uniformity," Mira whispered. "This world is not uniform." Lyra's jaw tightened. "It is unpredictable," she said. "Emotional surges, historical conflicts, rapid innovation cycles. Authority will classify that as risk." Ethan shifted his weight in the snow. "You do not need to translate for me," he said gently. "I get it." Lyra looked at him then, really looked at him, and something in her expression shifted from analysis to understanding. The sky pulsed again, brighter, urging response. Lyra lifted her chin slightly, as if addressing a distant council. Her voice changed, resonant and formal. "Comprehensive field assessment complete," she said into the unseen channel. "Human species demonstrates high emotional amplitude. However, cooperative capacity exceeds predicted thresholds. Adaptive morality present. Attachment behaviors strengthen survival probability rather than weaken it." Mira opened her eyes and added softly but firmly, "Volatility correlates with compassion. Compassion correlates with preservation." The geometric shimmer hesitated, flickering as though recalculating. For a long moment, nothing happened. The town continued its quiet afternoon. A pickup truck drove past, tires crunching overpacked snow. A dog barked somewhere behind a fence. Then the triangular outline in the sky dimmed, its edges dissolving back into pale blue. The pressure in the air eased, like a held breath finally released. Lyra's shoulders lowered. A fraction. Mira swayed slightly, and Ethan reached out instinctively, steadying her without thinking. She did not pull away. "What does that mean?" he asked. Lyra watched the last trace of distortion vanish. "It means," she said slowly, "that Earth has been reclassified." Mira looked up at him, silver eyes bright not with fear, but relief. "Not as threat," she added, "as anomaly worth observing without interference." Ethan gave a quiet, almost disbelieving laugh. "We get to stay messy," he said. Lyra's gaze softened again, lingering on him longer than before. "You were never the punishment," she murmured, almost to herself. The snow reflected sunlight across the small town, ordinary and unguarded. And high above, whatever had come to judge them turned away. That evening the sky returned to its ordinary blue, as if nothing beyond human sight had ever hovered above it. The town lights flickered fully back on just before sunset, porch bulbs glowing warm against fresh snow. Ethan's truck rolled slowly up the driveway, tires crunching in steady rhythm. No distortion, no shimmer, just wood smoke rising from chimneys and the faint sound of a snowblower somewhere down the road. Inside the house, the stove burned low and steady. Mira stood near the window again, but this time she was not analyzing structural weaknesses or escape routes. She was watching a child across the street attempt to build a snowman taller than himself, laughing every time the head rolled off. Lyra removed the borrowed flannel from her shoulders and folded it carefully, smoothing the fabric with deliberate attention before setting it on the back of a chair. "Reclassification is not permanent immunity," she said quietly. "Observation will continue." Ethan hung his coat by the door. "That is fine," he replied. "We are used to being watched." Mira turned from the window. "You are aware of surveillance?" she asked. Ethan gave a small half-smile. "Phones, satellites, social media. We built our own observers." Lyra's golden eyes reflected the firelight. "And yet you continue as if free." Ethan stepped closer to the stove and added another log, sparks rising briefly before settling. "Freedom is not the absence of oversight," he said. "It is the choice to act like you matter anyway." The room felt quiet again, but not heavy. The silence felt earned. Mira moved toward the bookshelf and picked up The Art of Fly Fishing, running her fingers over the cover before opening it. She did not analyze the binding this time. She simply began reading aloud, stumbling slightly over unfamiliar pronunciations. Lyra listened, seated at the small wooden table where they had shared tea that morning. "Your evaluation has altered more than planetary status," Lyra said after a moment. Mira paused mid-sentence. "It has altered us," she finished softly. Ethan looked between them. Was that not the point? Lyra met his gaze steadily. "We were sent to confirm deficiency," she said. "Instead, we discovered variability. And attachment." The word attachment lingered in the air, not clinical anymore. Mira closed the book gently. "Our return is optional," she said, almost surprised by the sound of it. "Authority will not compel retrieval." Ethan leaned back in his chair, studying their faces illuminated by firelight. "So," he said simply, "what do you want?" Outside, the child finally managed to balance the snowman's head in place and cheered in triumph. Mira watched the scene through the window, then glanced at her sister. Lyra's posture, once rigid with purpose, had softened into something more human in its uncertainty. She looked at Ethan, then at the small house around them. "We were told this world would correct us," Lyra said quietly. "It did." Mira nodded once. "Not through force," she added. "Through warmth." Ethan did not respond immediately. He only nodded, accepting their answer without demanding promises. The fire crackled softly. The snow outside reflected porch lights in gentle halos. And as night settled over Port Lawson, the two exiles who had arrived as punishment realized they had not been sent to learn weakness at all. They had been sent to witness something far rarer. In a galaxy that measured power by control, they had found a species that measured strength by kindness. And for the first time since leaving the stars, they did not feel assigned. They felt home.